He trains every morning and tracks every meal. Some people call this discipline, but for some men, it's something else entirely. We're filming this episode in Men's Health Month, and today I'm joined by my colleague, licensed social counselor Halima Said, to talk about male body image and eating disorders. Halima is an experienced and seasoned clinician with a range of expertise, including the issues that I mentioned, as well as relationship and intimacy challenges. Welcome, Halima.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, so I started by talking about some of the things that I think many of us are seeing these days, men as well as women, but our focal point here today is men, really focusing on what they eat, how they sleep, and their exercise performance. I really just want to start off by saying that that's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing, but sometimes it can tip into a more problematic area. How do you know when someone is struggling and we've started to move away from healthy, really important behaviors to something that might be a little bit more problematic?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at someone's functioning and how they're, more common things that I hear often is, hey, I don't feel like I can get through the day unless I go to this gym session, or I feel really depressed or anxious unless I went to this gym session, or maybe if they're tracking their food, it's all they think about all day. So just thinking about like throughout the day, how much does thinking about it, going to it, how many hours are you spending is impacting your day. So that's usually what we start off of, is thinking, okay, so this is your routine. That's good that you have this in your routine, but how much does it take space from your day and from your work and from your family, from your relationships?
Okay, so it sounds like one of the important things is really seeing how much mental energy it's taking up. And I guess related to that, one of the things that comes up for me when you say that is how people respond when there is a deviation. So imagining someone who really spends a lot of time planning the workouts, that today I'm going to do this, I need to eat this many macros and have this much sleep and these many types of supplements. And then suddenly, you're at the office and it's somebody's birthday and there's a lunch and you have that sandwich or whatever else is on offer. Is that also an indicator that we might be teetering into a problem?
Yes, possibly, right? I try not to say like for a fact this is an issue, right? But I think you're looking at how much food noise was around this piece of cake, right? You're at the office, you see that piece of cake, you thought about it 10 times, you went back to it, you tried to get a piece, then you went back into, I think those are the things, is like, why was there so much food noise? Like if there is maybe something around like, I'm trying to eat a certain way, I'm on a certain routine, or maybe I'm limiting sugar, right? Is that, okay, so with this one though, there is so much impact. And then what happens often is when you restrict something like this, a piece of cake, you end up maybe possibly having more than you can, overfilling yourself later on because you restricted yourself from it. And I think when you emphasize the word restriction, because I think that there's always, obviously, like balance is really important, but also without balance, then there's a lot of restriction. And when there's a lot of restriction, that other ways you end up coping with that.
Yeah, and I think when you were saying that, it reminded me of I think it's called the chocolate chip cookie study, and basically this idea that willpower is a finite resource. And so eventually, if we're constantly restricting ourselves, we're not going to be able to sustain that. And as you were rightfully saying, when we do deviate from that restriction, often we end up having so much more than we would have had if we were taking kind of a more moderate approach. And then what is some of the thought processes and emotional reactions you see in someone who has had a slip, quote unquote?
Yes. So it really depends, because we're talking only about restriction, because then sometimes when there's restriction, then there's, overeating, right? If we're talking about food specifically. But I think we look at the theme of control. So when someone slips, then they feel like I lost control. And if I lose control, then everything else is gone. And then I'm sure you've heard of like this idea, like all or nothing of, all right, I already had it, so then I'm going to go all out, right? So I think
start again tomorrow.
Exactly. And that's what restriction does, actually doesn't help, is that if you had that balance, you're already giving yourself what you need and you're balancing out that control throughout the day. But if you're restricting and trying to control for so long, we can say this about emotions all the time. When you hold a certain emotion for so long, right? What happens? Explodes. It's the same way with food. If you're holding and restricting for so long and there's a little bit of that balance, they explode. So when they go with that slipped, I see like some people completely emotional breakdown of like, I ruined everything, right? It depends what that meant for them. What does that control and restriction means for them? Like what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to your body? And what's the perception that you've created around this slip?
What are some of the common perceptions that people have created around slips relating to food? And then maybe we can even broaden it a little bit to skipping a gym day, because I would imagine there might be some similarities there.
I think it depends on each person of what it means for them, because I think I've seen where it might mean it was more of this is how I stay disciplined. And there's this perception that I'm a very disciplined person.
Yes.
And if I have that slip, then I'm no longer this disciplined person and I'm not perfect anymore. So sometimes I see often actually with eating disorders is perfectionism. That if I need to, and I want to specify eating disorders a specific kind, like for example, bulimia or anorexia, right? Any kind of form of restriction is included. And I see it as well with binge eating, but specifically the most I'll see it with restriction, I just want to emphasize that, is that need for perfection and control. But also I think that with food, and it's just a form of control. For some people, it could be other things. But if we're specifically talking about food, that perception is I'm using food to feel in control in my life.
Yes.
So it's not really about the meal. It's really about, this is the one way I feel like nothing in my life feels in control, but I can control food. I can control my workouts and I can control my discipline. And if this is the only way. Now, the other one is also could be that this is the way that if we're talking about a gym routine and it needs to be 2 or 3 hours, right? Still disciplined, but could also be emotional. This is the only way that I can let out my anger. This is the only way that if I feel sad, I can, I've seen so many trends on TikTok where it's like, you go to the gym and if you don't go to that gym, then you feel like you had a bad day all day, and they'll show like this outburst that happens, or like you can't talk to anybody all day if you didn't go to the gym. There's also trends around, especially I see this on Instagram, trends around like, oh, you're heartbroken, go to the gym, right? So I think there's that perception of going to the gym is getting your life back together. It's finding more control, but then it's starting to get so tied into emotional coping, I'm seeing. And I think social media plays a role in that.
That's so interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. And I'm really glad that you're pointing this out, because I think a lot of people believe that the main element at play in any type of eating disorder is body image. I'm no expert like you. That can be a significant part of it, but as you're rightfully saying, a really strong part of it is control, specifically for some of the eating disorders. And then at the beginning of what you were sharing, one of the things that you mentioned is people having that identity. Like, I'm a disciplined person. I am a regimented person. All of these things are things that we tend to see as being positive. They have a positive spin to them. And I think in general, with, the rise of anxiety and also kind of being in a historical time and context where there's a lot of stuff that's outside of our control, having something that you can control regardless of all of what's happening around you, I can see why why people would be drawn to that. So the identity piece, I get it. The control piece, I get it. And then the emotional expression. And I think what's so challenging here is, again, all of these things are good things. So I would imagine a lot of people go unchecked, even by people that are close to them, because it's like, yeah, he or she is disciplined, and they also look good because whatever it is that they're doing is,
body image is also important, yeah.
is feeding into whatever their goals are. And it's not necessarily about shape. It can be about muscle mass or size or whatever it is. And going to the gym does make you feel good, right? It is a release, and it is really important. So there's just so many overlapping layers here to this, to eating disorders.
And the body image part is, of course, a big one, right? When we're looking at control, is I can control my image. So it's not just controlling the food and the discipline. It's all kind of connects back into the body. Is that then I can control a little bit. If there's other things that I'm not good at, this is something I can be good at. I can work on my body. I can build that muscle, right? So that's also a big part as well, especially in Dubai. I think that there's a big idea that how you look and your body image is how you present yourself here.
And I think as well with the UAE, and I don't have any data to support this, but just sort of anecdotally in my work and in my life experience, Dubai, there is a self-selection bias, right? A lot of people that are drawn to all of the opportunities and amazing things that we have here are people that are go-getters, and people that are go-getters are the ones that are probably going to want to wear, I'm disciplined and I'm regimented as a badge of honor. So I think so many pieces are kind of interconnected here.
And like you said, these are all good things, right? Going to the gym, eating healthy, right? And it brings up your dopamine levels, like all these things that, I always recommend working out to clients as well. And that when they're feeling stressed out, it really helps with releasing stress. And we know that so many people in Dubai are stressed out. And I always say, like, are you working? Are you releasing any other energy out, right? So these are all good things. And it's just looking at when it becomes that a lot of hiding around it, like, oh, I spent 4 hours, or, hiding around like why you're not eating with everyone else, why you're not eating in the business meetings or lunch meetings. That's when it becomes like completely restriction, where it's maybe more than just about, hey, I want to be healthy. That's when it becomes concerning.
Yeah, when it's impacting on so many different domains, when it's taking up a lot of mental real estate, when it becomes your only or your primary way of expressing emotions because perhaps other ways don't feel super safe. Before we kind of get into that emotional suppression, and for males specifically, I wanted to ask you about the prevalence of eating disorders. So I think most people, when they think of eating disorders, they think that it's primarily women that are afflicted by these disorders. And I think in large part that is true. However, I think there's probably some nuance and some layers there about things getting diagnosed, as well as the prevalence of males in certain types of eating disorders.
Yes. So I do know that eating disorders in general in society has always seen as a feminine thing, right? Like you're watching your weight. And I think it's the behaviors are considered feminine, right? Watching your weight. You're not going to hear a man say, like, often, I'm just watching my weight. You say, I'm going to the gym and counting my macros, right? They're not going to say, I'm watching my weight. So therefore, if they say it in a certain way, I think men use certain terminology that gets ignored in therapy spaces, right? Like, yeah, I'm just, making sure I'm eating this amount of protein. I don't know how many grams for the day, but they're all very specific. And I think that it can come off as, okay, they know what they're doing, right? And it's not that they don't know what they're doing, but also you may not notice the signs unless you ask more, right? And I think it's also that if, often I see it with men is saying like, I didn't go to the gym today, so I feel really angry. I don't feel like I can get through the day. Also, a lot of times I've seen depression show up if you aren't doing your gym routine as well as like, okay, so if depression was there and that gym was helping with that, then maybe there's more work to do around that than just the gym session, because you want to be able to go on a holiday and not look for the nearest gym all the time, right? Because I've seen that as well. How it showed up is going on holidays and then not actually enjoying the holiday because you don't know where the nearest gym is. I've seen people really struggle with that. And that's when you're looking at like, where's that balance that you can have.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing from you is that sometimes in a therapy space, I would imagine whether it's individual work or couples or broader family work, people are saying things and those things are going undetected because, like you said, the way that they're expressed maybe seems more objective. I don't know if that's the right word, but like when a person says something like, I'm trying to get down a couple of sizes because I'm going on vacation, then it's pretty apparent that there is a body image element, but also possibly other things that you were referencing before. But when someone is like, oh yeah, I meal prepped because I need to make sure I'm hitting my protein goals because of whatever, it doesn't have that automatic and very clear tie to the body image and the other things. So it gets swept under the rug. And I think now, I don't know if you've observed this or what your thoughts are, there is so much more happening on social media in terms of like even fitness influencers. So it's almost normalized a lot of this behavior, which can be normal, but there's a fine line between when it's normal and when it's adaptive and when it's functional and when it becomes problematic. So clinicians aren't necessarily noticing it because it's kind of less obvious. And that's just for people that are showing up in therapy spaces. We know that a lot of people don't necessarily even do that to begin with. So eating disorders are primarily thought of as a female issue. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, for anorexia and bulimia, the prevalence is higher in females, but for binge eating, it might be the other way around.
Well, binge eating in general over the years has increased. So binge eating, I think people forget it's also comes from restriction as well. So they're all kind of interconnected, but I would say binge eating shows up a lot with men as well. If anything, I probably see it. I mean, I see it with both, but usually when I'm talking to male clients, there is more of a binging happening, showing up in different ways, but yeah, it definitely is happening, especially when they're so focused on calorie counting throughout the week and then it comes for that day, then that's when we can see that what's a binge. And I also have to define what a binge is to clients. And like, because sometimes I think this is the issue as well that I'm seeing on social media is using words like binging and restriction sometimes as like trendy words or like just say, oh, I just had a binge. And I'm like, okay, when I'm talking to clients, I always say, can you tell me what the binge was? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I ate 2 plates of food. I'm like, okay, but what was in that? Like how much food was it? Because when we're talking about binges, I'm looking at like, okay, so when I've worked with a lot of binge eating cases, it's like I bought 2 boxes of cookies and I ate through all of them within an hour, right? Or I've went into 3 different restaurants, ordered 3 different meals and had them all at once. That's usually when we're looking at severe binging, right? And where it's more of an issue. And how fast you ate is also important, right? And were you connected to your body when you were eating? Right? Usually it's like, no, I was disassociated. I wasn't connected to my body. And how did you feel after? I didn't feel good. So those are all signs of a binge, is how you feel after. Like you ate 2 plates, but you feel good and content. All right. Sometimes you're going to have those days where you were extra hungry. So one of the things is we talk about is knowing our hunger levels when we're eating, before we're eating, after we're eating. It's being in tune of your hunger. So if you felt like I was a little extra hungry and I maybe ate more food, that's not a binge. That's just you were a little hungry. You skipped lunch, maybe. So dinner time, you probably wanted a little bit more food. Let's normalize that part. Versus if you're restricting throughout the day and you ate a big meal, that's not binging.
No, I think it's really important that you are operationalizing these terms because, like you said, people are throwing around terms that have clinical heft in a way that maybe isn't super accurate and can mischaracterize what's going on. So in terms of assessing binging, what I heard from you is you look at things including the volume of food that was eaten, the time that it took to get through that food, as well as some of the emotions that came up afterwards. What are some of the prevalent emotions that people will experience after a binge eating episode?
Shame is the biggest one. Always sharing, like, I felt just guilty. I felt shameful. I felt sad. I didn't feel good about myself. Right? That's when we know this is a problem, right? Because there's people like, yeah, I went out and I maybe ate more than usual, but I'm fine the next day. Versus I felt really bad. And also the other thing is what they do with the shame and the guilt and the sadness is then they go and try to restrict the next day, all day, or like and restriction I want to emphasize what restriction can look like is like, it could be also not restricting food, but also going in and working out for 6 hours to compensate for the food you ate. So it's another form of like purging, we call it. Some people think purging only looks one way. Actually, overexercising is one of them. So we start to see that, and then they go back into that same cycle again. I restricted all day, I didn't eat, then they go and binge and feel shame. Then they go the next day, and the cycle keeps going. And that's when you know it's a problem. And this is the most actually common one I hear clients say, is like, yeah, what did you do after the binge, right? I couldn't sleep. I just kept thinking about how am I going to do? What am I going to do tomorrow to burn the calories?
To undo it. Yeah. So it does sound like a really difficult cycle to be caught up in. And as you were explaining that shame is one of the primary emotions that comes up, what I started picturing then is people that maybe live with other people. And so does that shame in your experience translate into hiding some of these behaviors?
So much hiding. And again, if we're talking about men, it can look different, right? They hide it by going to the gym, right? And maybe it's not going to be, oftentimes I see also hiding of food and snacks. It's also understanding where that comes from, that shame around family, because oftentimes I do see that a lot of the clients I've worked with eating disorders also come from families that had a lot of restriction at the house, or they believe in skipping a meal. Like, we only have breakfast and dinner. It's like, okay, but so that person felt shameful if they wanted something in the middle of the day, or snacks, certain snacks were labeled as good and bad, which I always tell parents, like, you know, if you notice your kid is struggling, you probably want to avoid labeling good and bad foods so they can find that balance, because that can create some kind of distortions around food, right? So lots of hiding in general that we see. Hiding, you'd be surprised where people hide food.
Okay, tell me more. What are some really surprising or interesting places that people told you that they've hidden food in your previous experience? I've heard about under the bed. I don't know if that would qualify as being very surprising. Or
I mean, under the bed is, I don't even hear that one often. It's usually the closet, the drawers,
closet, okay.
Right? The bathrooms, the living room, somewhere, like a certain pocket somewhere. Everyone has their own thing. And some people, they just move out so they can eat as much as they want. So everyone has their own form of what hiding looks like. Or their cars. That's a big one, actually. I had a lot of clients where it would be, they'd go to the grocery store specifically, get a bunch of snacks, have it in their car, and then go home. Right? Also, there's also what includes hiding is wanting to hide all the boxes, the snacks and everything as much as they can, like wanting to dispose of it before they get home or before someone comes home, is let me make sure there's no proof this is happening. And this is the part where shame comes up a lot. But, you know, it's kind of, it's a lot of times I hear, you know, either it's from parents or from clients saying, like clients' families are saying, well, I know that this was happening. It was so obvious, because they're not really good at hiding. People usually find the wrappers in the trash can or, you know, so that's another thing is usually the families know when there is some kind of problem. They just don't say anything about it because then the shame cycle continues, right?
So we said that shame is one of the emotions that comes up, and we spoke sort of throughout this conversation about emotional expression and also suppression. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit more for men specifically.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I've been seeing a lot with my work with men, especially nowadays in society and the economy, and this is all over the world, it's not even just here, is that pressure. Men have a lot of pressure to provide and to be a certain way. And I think where the conflict that I see often that happens with men is, you know, when they're suppressing their emotions, whether it's anger. One of the things that I notice men they try their best not to talk too much about with their significant others or with their families or with their kids or with their schoolmates, right? It depends on the ages, is that, you know, I have this pressure to provide and I have this pressure to be a man, masculine man. But also if I say I'm feeling stress or anger, which are the big two ones that I get a lot, like I'm feeling stressed about something or I'm feeling angry about something, they tend to suppress that a lot. And it shows up in all kinds of ways, like working out, right? Is that there's this conflict when they're also being told, you should feel your feelings. Men should feel their feelings. But then the men are like, well, if I have to feel my feelings, I was maybe raised possibly to be told that to be a man, you hide your feelings so that you can be a strong provider.
Yes.
So then if we tell them feel your feelings, they're going to have this conflict of like, you want me to feel my feelings. If I do, I'm going to be called possibly feminine, right? Or I'm going to be told I'm not man enough, right? But you're also telling me to be a provider and to be this and to be responsible for the family. You know, I've seen all kinds of responsibilities men have, whether they're the eldest son, whether it's because, you know, they have to provide for the entire family, not just for their significant other and their kids. Maybe it's for their parents. And at the same time, they're like, well, if I start to feel angry or sad or all these other feelings outwardly, you might then change your image of me.
Yes.
Right? And also, I may be conditioned to believe that the only way for me to be this strong and to carry these responsibilities is to suppress my emotions. And I think this is where a conflict I see that a lot of men have. But then also, you know, when I'm working with them, right, this is their outlet. And it's always so nice to hear them just say, yeah, this is hard and I don't like this and I wish I can talk about it. But I know if I talk about it, people are going to criticize me as a man for saying that this is tough, this is stressful. Being a provider is stressful.
Of course.
Right? this economy is stressing me out, right? Or if they maybe have different thoughts of how finances should look like, they get criticized a lot. So in what ways do society suppress them in that way? And what does a masculine role look like? And if you stray away a little bit from it, there might be this perception that they then are not man enough. And I think this is where suppression happens a lot.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense the way that you just laid it out, because those two things really can be in opposition and create that cognitive dissonance and that internal turmoil, because these are mixed messages. And I know it's 2026, and I know that, we globally are kind of wanting to recognize and encourage men to acknowledge and tap into and express their feelings. But the reality is, how safe is that for them in their ecosystem that they're a part of, whether that's on a broader level, their societal, their sociocultural context, or whether it's more specifically within their family ecosystem. And if I think about what you said, somebody coming home and, crying about a difficult day or saying, I feel scared, or all of that, I can imagine so many people looking at that person in a different light. And I would love for the interpretation or the reaction to be one of support and safety and collaboration and comfort. But the reality is that's not often going to be the case, right?
But you know what I've heard at least 10 times working with couples is this always comes up when the man in the room shares his feelings and takes a moment. I always hear, no, it's a good thing. I always hear the woman say, it's so nice to hear him talk about his feelings. Like, you can see the relief that the women sometimes have, and that excitement, and like, wow, like you were feeling that way, right? And the question is, why are they able to do it in our therapy spaces, but at home with their partner that they've been with for years, that it's so hard for them to just say that? And that's usually the question, right? And obviously the therapy space brings out things, right? But also, what kind of safety can you establish that in the home as well? But always, all the time. And then I always say, sometimes when I'm working with women and they'll say, I'll recommend couples therapy, right? When they're talking about, hey, I'm having this issue and all this, I'll say, yeah, you should go to couples therapy. And they always say, oh, I don't think my partner or my husband is going to go to couples therapy. There's no way he's going to talk. And I said, listen, once my experience in couples,
yes,
they always talk the most. They don't stop talking.
I agree. I completely
they
agree.
They don't stop talking.
Yeah, but not at the beginning. So for me, in my experience, it's always been a little bit slower to warm up. And then once that like safety and that rapport and that therapeutic alliance is established, and this idea that they're both women and, they're going to gang up against me and she's going to see her perspective and not mine. Once that's sort of shattered, then they do. And I've had that experience as well of women being like, oh, it's such a relief, because a lot of times for the female partner, what they think they're feeling is totally different. And sometimes it's even worse, especially if the female partner kind of has more of an anxious attachment. But then the other thing that I have sometimes is the male partner will start sharing his feelings, which is what she's desperately waiting for. And all of a sudden it turns into, well, oh yeah, well, I feel this way, or like just shutting down or kind of correcting. And then you can get a little bit of a glimpse into what some of the relational dynamics are that contribute to that lack of safety and why the therapeutic space is so important.
Have you heard of the concept of masculine toxicity? Have you heard of feminine toxicity?
No.
Exactly. Exactly. We don't talk about feminine toxicity, right? Now, do we want to focus on these terms? Maybe not too much, but feminine toxicity can also include when women use tears and their own emotions, given that they've always, depending on their experiences, there is a privilege we do have, right? It was normalized. Yeah, it was still criticized, but it was normalized that women are going to be the ones that cry. So it makes it easier to cry because it's normalized for us to cry. But I've seen women use their tears and their emotions to also abuse and suppress. And that's where feminine toxicity can come out a little bit.
Interesting.
I know. Different topic, but this one's a big one. But I think that not everyone talks about it enough, but I do see it in what ways that, you know, sometimes women in their relationships contribute to the suppression of men, right? And they're like, oh, you talked about your feelings, I'm going to start crying. Then it becomes about the woman again.
Yes.
Right. And you see that, I'm sure, in couples sometimes, and finding that balance of like, you want something, how do we make that space for all your feelings so you both get what you need?
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and sort of zooming out in terms of males, like what I'm hearing from you and what I've also observed and studied as well is that across the board, and maybe in some contexts more than others, but globally and historically, men are taught to, you know, be strong. The role that they're socialized into is to be a provider. And even now in more contemporary times where women have higher labor force participation and contribute economically to their home environment, they're still supposed to be the provider more, and they're also supposed to be the protector. And those two things we associate with strength, and certain emotions we, you know, unfortunately associate with weakness. So there's historical messages, there are in their adult lives contemporary messages that they're experiencing, and then there's also this dynamic that's happening in their close relationship. So yeah, having a conversation, being vulnerable, being met with, you know, more tears or a more intense other emotion, it's a lot. Just go to the gym. I can see why there's an appeal sometimes, you know?
Yes. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with men needing that outlet, because I think a lot of men don't have that outlet, and this is what's helping them. It's more like hoping and wanting more for men than just the gym, where they maybe use it and abuse it in some ways because they don't have other outlets. And I know they want other outlets. It's not that they just know this is the only one that I can get through and feel okay after. And also, you know, it's interesting when I'm working with just one of my colleagues, actually, every time I have a couple and I need to it's always commonly the woman is already with the individual therapist. And I was like, I asked the man, do you have an individual therapist? Absolutely no, never. But I have a colleague that she's the one person that I used to always refer the males to her. And that's because she knows exactly, you know, I know I can send to her because she knows exactly what they're going to want. And she always introduces the feelings wheel. And once men get to have their own space to talk about their feelings, and it's confidential, and they get introduced to a feelings wheel, which is a wheel of feelings that introduces it. I always call it the training wheels to feelings. I think every man should be gifted a feelings wheel. And they get so excited. She'll tell me, like, you know what, the clients, they love seeing the feelings wheel. They love learning about their feelings. And then one of the things that men say a lot in individual therapy, when it's in their first time, in the first few sessions, I don't know if you've seen this, where they say, this makes sense. Or this is such a good question. Because no one asks them these questions. I was like, really? That's a good question? It was just a very general question about your feelings. They're like, amazing question. Right? And I think that's where introducing the idea of therapy and just the idea of a space for you, that you also can find other ways of outlets too.
And this outlets piece I think is critical, because every single one of us needs to offload. And for females, I think it's more acceptable for us to be able to do that with one another. Forget about in the therapy space. We've got our friends. We can talk to them. I've said multiple times on this podcast, I have another podcast running every day with my best friend where I just like download, and she's in a totally different time zone and she gets it and she downloads. That is so valuable. But I think many men, if they're listening to this conversation, what are they going to do? Like call up their buddy and be like, I had a really hard day. Let's talk about it. I was feeling really sad. And imagine they do. Often I would imagine that really wouldn't be met with what might be needed. It would seem very kind of strange. And in their relationships, maybe they have more of a space, but then what if part of their struggle is in their relationship? Then who do they talk to? So having that feelings wheel,
find women to talk to. Right? Because women, it's normal to express your feelings, maybe even to women, as much as like sometimes they don't feel like they can express themselves, but still women are actually a space that provide that. But how often have you asked men, hey, what do you guys talk about when you're with a group of guys?
Yeah.
Like, we definitely don't talk about feelings. That
No.
would be wrong.
It would be
I know
so
sometimes
weird.
they do.
Yeah.
But they will never admit it.
No. And I think maybe it would be more like certain feelings that are more acceptable. Like maybe
Exactly.
rage is
Anger.
not acceptable, but anger is much more acceptable, right? So they might be able to talk about things like that. But as you were saying, men can, have these conversations with women. That's very true. But then it kind of opens up another Pandora's box, which is if they're not having those emotionally deep conversations with their partner, assuming they're partnered and they're having it with other women, then that also can be problematic because they're building emotional intimacy in a relationship outside of their primary partnership, which is
very
common. And part of the reason that many people do come and knock on our doors to begin with, I think. Yeah. So the emotional suppression, I think it's something that is historical. It's something contemporary. Males have less outlets, but what we really want them to do is be able to find others. And it's not just about talking. Even some females have less desire to be kind of sharing things verbally, but as long as they can cathartically release, like it can be through journaling or it can be through, creating music or art or working on some kind of a project. Like there are other ways to release, I think, right?
I think men do really well in finding things that they can do with their hands when they're feeling something and expressive, like building and creating. I've seen that as a huge outlet for men when they try to figure things out when it's not emotional, right? And because realistically, I don't think even if they maybe in the therapy space they feel comfortable expressing all their feelings, but outside, how much of it can they realistically do where they feel like safe to do it? And I think that there are a lot of outlets. Actually, I notice it's always creative things that they can do with their hands that they feel like they can build or whatever it is that is for them that is outside of their work. Because again, one of the biggest things I've seen a lot with men is the stress of work and then the responsibility. So there's so many levels of pressure. Is like, how do you release that? And again, it goes back to the gym, right? And lifting those weights, right? And it could be a good outlet and just finding other outlets as well.
Yeah. So anybody listening to us today, wondering if it's me or my partner or someone close to me that's struggling, I noticed that I or he, goes to the gym every day, counting their macros, like making sure they get 8 hours of sleep. How do we know, or what can we advise them to kind of look out for or ask themselves to evaluate if it's staying in the realm of healthy versus unhealthy? So some of the things that you mentioned already have to do with the food noise. It has to do with the restriction. It has to do with what they're doing really signifies for them. So the control or the identity, the feelings that they might experience afterwards. Is there anything else that we can kind of keep an eye on?
I think you listed most of them, especially seeing like, I think oftentimes I hear clients say, I just don't like that I keep thinking about it. Like, and that's where it becomes a problem because they'll say, I feel like I can't enjoy my time with my friends. I feel like I can't enjoy my time with my family. This is where I feel like it's a problem. And it's that idea is not feeling you have control over it. We always say, like with eating disorders, I always say, what is the eating disorder voice is doing or saying? Because it does feel like a voice that is constantly there and doesn't let you enjoy things. And then the other thing is noticing if there's other things you're avoiding in your life.
Okay.
Right? Because a lot of times when you're focusing on these things is what else should you be focusing on instead? And in what way does this make you avoid everything?
Okay. What are some of the things that people avoid and, replace with some of these behaviors / fixations?
It's a lot of things. It could be maybe a marriage, a lot of tension in the marriage. It could be trouble with dating and body image issues. All right, not feeling rejected. A lot of times rejection, and feeling like, I don't want to be rejected again, so I'm just going to focus on this and not engage in interactions or socializing with other people. They just focus on this one thing. It could be also just things that may have happened in their life, like a grieving a loss of someone. It could be family. It could be also maybe some trauma that is still kind of lingering that never resolved. And sometimes it's easier to just focus on the one thing you can control. or specifically complex trauma, meaning like it's still happening and something maybe is happening at home with their family or back home. Depends. I think it's a lot of things for a lot of people. I've seen everything, to be honest. That's why I always say it's not the food because it's always, there's so much things that it's rooted to, all kinds of problems that are happening around, and that food is easier access. I do want to say one last thing about that when we're talking about food. There is a cultural piece here, especially if you come from a culture where alcohol and drugs is not something that, you know, that showed up in your family as much. Food tend to be the one that used and abused. And that's why it's showing up with food. Because people ask me that all the time. Why is it food? Why isn't it not anything else? And I was like, well, how significant was food in your household? And if it was alcohol or anything else at home, which I see often with when I'm working with people with alcohol addiction, alcohol was what was used and abused at home or restricted. So it's really looking at that. In what ways does cultural piece play that for you as well, that you've used this as a way to avoid?
Yeah, and I think the culture piece is really significant for so many reasons. And, you know, if I think about, you know, as someone who is from an Arab background, you know, food for us is everything. It is the heart of the social gathering. It is the way to express love and care. It's even sometimes an apology. Like, how many of us growing up had friends or family members that maybe wanted to express sorrow over something, didn't have the language, didn't feel comfortable being able to do that, and instead made us our favorite dinner.
Yes.
Like, food is so central.
And funerals too. You bring food to the family, right?
Very, very, very true. So it has a lot of associations with it.
Exactly.
And then, you know, reflecting again about being younger and growing up, you said earlier on about the idea of hunger cues. We are also socialized to ignore our hunger cues. And a lot of times when we're not kind of eating the volume we should when we're younger, there is feedback that's given to us that can be shaming. I think all of us have heard, you know, there's starving children here, there, and everywhere that would be so happy to eat the food that you are sort of rejecting, and then teaching or encouraging us to ignore our bodies. And I would imagine that promotes a little bit of dissociation and can be problematic. And I'm not saying that anyone who heard that growing up, you know, their parents or their family or their culture was setting them up for eating disorders, but there are small things that happen over the course of our lives, embedded more broadly within our culture, that affect us.
Yes. And on that point, actually, when I always have to introduce eating disorders and hunger and full cues, I always say, when you're a baby, most babies, what do? They cry when they're hungry, and they always stop drinking the milk when they're full. So we're naturally born with healthy hunger and full cues, right? For the most part, most babies. So naturally, we actually, one of the things that we can tell when we're born is whether we're full and whether we're hungry. We knew to cry. But then what happened? And that's where the food noise starts to happen from family. When you start hiding like bad snacks, right, around your kid, then the kid is going to be like, okay, this is a bad snack. I want it more, right?
Yes.
So then it can create those bad habits over time. Or we always call it the clean plate mentality, which is, you know, there's food on your plate, you need to finish it. So you're already teaching your kid that they should, even though they feel full, they ate half their plate, let's say, is instead of saying finish your plate, is like, okay, let's put it away and we're going to come back to it maybe lunchtime or something like that. Like, let's finish it later, instead of forcing them to eat over their fullness. And this is where it starts, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think it's also really difficult because one of the things I've been thinking about in the back of my mind during this conversation is possibly part of the origins of an eating disorder, but not always. And that is picky eating. Because a lot of times we'll see that with young children who will refuse to eat certain types of food. They eat a very small amount of food. And I know there's so many things that can be contributing to that. It can be sensory, for example.
Yes.
There's a lot of input. So I'm not trying to suggest anything sort of specific, but when I reflect on parents that have a picky eater, often what will happen with this whole thing is it becomes a power struggle. right? And then I would imagine if there is an element of control that the child is
Yes.
feeling, then that's just going to create more of that headbutting and more sort of frustration in the situation.
Yes, it's control and anxiety, right? And I've worked with people with developmental disabilities, and they'll say for them, color, for example, they've focused on one color, they can only eat food in one color. It's different, right? And I think parents will notice it at a young age, and they think, oh, they're just being a kid, right? But it's something that is connected to multiple things for them. But also, there's a lot of fear around moving around those foods as well. So yeah.
And I think, for parents, if they're noticing that their child is becoming maybe more restrictive or more picky during certain periods, it might be worth kind of evaluating what else is going on, and if that might be more of a reaction rather than a phase, a change in the palate, or some other issue or challenge that they're experiencing.
Definitely. Yeah, very psychological as well. And kids are so amazing is that they express in so many different ways that you can imagine, including in their food. Yeah.
Halima, thank you so much for all of your insights and your input today. I think it was such an important conversation because, as we know, eating disorders are prevalent. They are problematic in so many ways. A lot of people are struggling with body image. And importantly, I think what we were trying to really emphasize today in light of Men's Health Month is that we don't realize it impacts men too. And the origins of that start young, but also exist in their adult life and experiences. So I think in conclusion, we can say to everyone, all of the things that we talked about can be good. Going to the gym, eating well, caring about what you look like. But what we really want to do is make sure that it's not taking up too much space in our heads, in our calendars, and it's not our only outlet for experiencing emotions, especially some of the quote, so-called negative emotions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.